China is being increasingly viewed as a strategic competitor to the U.S. in terms of economy, geopolitics, and global influence by Washington officials. Recently, a U.S. State Department official brought up a civilizational and racial characterization of the competition between the U.S. and China, drawing attention to the already high-profile and complicated bilateral relations. With the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations approaching, how should the thinking and discussion on civilizations help address the problems in the world? What lessons can China and the U.S. learn from history? And what is new and unique about the bilateral relations that can't be easily compared? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. We shall also be joined via satellite by Professor Dennis Wilder from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and Pavel Falkenhor, a Russian defense analyst. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, Professor Huang.
Well, thank you.
Is the current competition between the United States and China racially motivated? Because this debate has been triggered by the recent remarks of a senior diplomatic official of the State Department in the D.C.
Mrs. Skinner's remarks is way off the mark, and I do not believe China and United States competition, whatever we define, can be a racial-based, because that's totally nonsense. Yes, China and United States may have different way of life, and China and United States may have different models of development. That's debatable, and of course we can say who is on the right side or wrong side of history, but to take this as because China is a non-Caucasian civilization, that is intellectually stupid, and politically self-destructive and strategically very, very disastrous.
One of the major reasons for the media the world over to discuss this headline-making story, a story delivered by this African-American diplomat from the State Department, is that for the first time an African-American president was voted into office.
Yes.
This country, which is clearly aware of the skin colors since perhaps the movement of civil liberty by Reverend Martin Luther King, is a great power in advocating for soft power. So what do you think of the deep background against which this strategic competition is taking place and perhaps shaping the future of the world?
I think that you can argue that this competition is caused, for example, by different way of life, or you can argue that because China and the United States have totally different political system, have different value systems, so on and so forth. And you can also argue from the, what we want, this kind of point of view, that China's rise has threatened Americans' interests or even national security interests. But after all, even you can argue it's different civilizations. But from Ms. Skinner's point of view, it's because China is none of the Western civilizations. And she specifically said it's because China is a non-Caucasian civilizations. That is way off the mark. Yes, even though by Samuel Huntington, even the clash of civilization is arguable, debatable, because you do not have to be a Caucasian to be a Christian. You do not have to be Arab to be take a faith in Islamic culture. But racial definition of the two powers that happen to be compete against each other only happened when there's a Nazi. When Nazism is entirely based on race. That's why Hitler's Nazis slaughtered the Jewish people. That's why we have to totally bury Nazism, because there's no place in human being. So that's why it's very surprised for Mrs. Skinner herself, who could be a model of American dream. Because American dreams is colorblind, is race blind. You can be an Asian, you can be white, you can be black, you can be whoever you want, as long as you believe in Americanism, you can make it. That's what American dream is all about. But for her to say that, it's entirely anti-Americanism. I think that this kind of thinking has done irreparable damage to Americanism, and also I do not believe that's a mainstream of American thinking at all. Of course, Steve Bannon jumped up to praise her. That tells us exactly what kind of thinking coming from.
So she's not fighting alone. A beneficiary of the Affirmative Act in the United States Mrs. Skinner herself has drawn a lot of fire from the American media,
Yes.
and it seems American opinions are seriously divided, and she has come under severe scrutiny from within the United States. So what do you think of the domestic response in the United States?
I think we know that Americans are always proud to be a melting pot. And no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what kind of civilizations you value based on, if you join America, you become American, and you can always make it. And Mrs. Skinner herself could be a role model for all the Americans because she made it. But that's why it is so appalling for people like her who could be a model, a role model for Americanism, for American dream, make such a really, really disastrous racial remarks as a policy, one of the policymakers in Washington, D.C.
She's director of the policy planning staff of the State Department. Let me cross over to Professor Dennis Wilder, who's standing by in the D.C. He's the dean or a senior professor with the School of Foreign Service at the Georgetown University. Hello. Hello, Professor Wilder.
Good evening.
Do you think Madam Skinner is likely to be fired because a former president of Harvard University who made some controversial remarks about gender discrimination was sacked by the board of directors immediately? What do you think of the future of this senior lady, a senior diplomat at the State Department?
Well, frankly, if I were within the Trump administration, I would fire her for these remarks. Yeah. Because I think they are very dangerous. I think they're very damaging to the American image. First of all, her remarks were not historically correct when she said that this is the first time we have had some sort of conflict between the Caucasian world and non-Caucasian world. After all, Pearl Harbor, the Japanese, certainly that was a conflict far greater than the one we are having with China right now. Secondly, Americans are now 40% non-white. The American majority of whites is much smaller, and as your other guest has pointed out, we are a melting pot. We are not this kind of nation. So I think what she represents are the kind of fringe views of Steve Bannon and others. Steve Bannon was fired from the White House for being a fringe element in the administration. I do not know why Dr. Skinner should remain in her position unless she's willing to retract these kinds of remarks.
So far, we haven't heard any apologies from Madam Skinner. Let me cross over to Pavel,
and she needs to.
She has to, yes.
She has to apologize, by the way. But
so.
Pavel, what do you make of this latest flare-up of the media debates concerning racial remarks by this lady in the State Department? Pavel?
Well, it's clear that they were just factually untrue, as we've just pointed out. I mean, the Pacific War and many American defeats and also victories, it was also kind of all non-Caucasians. And also actually talking about real different civilizations today, in today's world, I believe that's just also factually wrong. That's a thing of the past. China's present development, the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, were just about opening China to the world. And today China is very much a champion of continued globalization. So, of course, there's lots of difference between China and America, China and Russia, or some other country, but basically this is one all-world civilization, because civilizations are defined as self-sustaining entities. And now today, in today's world, no one is really self-sustaining absolutely, even the United States. And absolutely not China, not talking about other nations. It's a one civilization, and that actually means that conflicts are more severe inside one civilization than between different civilizations. The First and Second World War were inside one civilization, because the competition inside the framework of a single worldwide civilization has become apparently more acute. And that's an important point that's been missed by those who promote very primitive, I would say more or less racist ideas.
If you would go back to the Holocaust that had somehow been triggered by Nazi Germany over the issue of Zionism and Semitism, let me ask you one follow-up question concerning what happened at the height of the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States. It seems, according to this school of thought, which of course are very controversial, that the Orthodox was part of Christianity, and what happened, the serious clashes geopolitically between the Soviet Union and the United States was only a matter, purely a matter under the same roof of Christianity. China's rise is regarded therefore as very much alien and therefore should be the subject of a common crusade by Christians. Is that a loaded argument that needs to be examined very carefully by the media? Pavel.
Well, yes, it has been for at least quite some time. Many in the United States believe that China is potentially more of a threat to America than Russia because Russia is economically much weaker and is not stagnating, and China is very much developing, so maybe Russia has more nuclear weapons. And that Russia could be somehow persuaded to kind of join the West in a standoff with China, that Russia is threatened by China, and kind of can be recruited to be in the front trenches of a standoff with China. Russia doesn't want that to happen, at least the present Russian leadership, and I believe President Vladimir Putin's policy on China are very practical and very correct. And it's not a Russian task, and it's actually the Christianity thing. Well, during the Cold War, Soviet Union was not a Christian nation. It was a communist atheist state, and not Christian at all. And now, of course, officially it's Christian, but then, of course, also the Christian Orthodox faith in Russia is a bit superficial. I mean, everyone says that they're Christian, but they don't go to church almost at all.
Let me go back.
So it's not a clash of different religions. It's more geopolitics.
Let me cross over back to Professor Wilder. Following the cancellation of a visit by Secretary Pompeo to Germany and ahead of a visit by President Donald Trump to Germany, to the UK, and ahead of the commemoration of Normandy landing, we have this military parade in the Red Square of Moscow, and President Vladimir Putin delivered a message to emphasize the huge victory against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. What do you think of this issue of flexing muscles at the height of a standoff between the United States and China?
Well, I think that the Russian leader is going to take advantage of these disputes between the United States and China. He sees it in his interest to increase the tension in the relationship. After all, he interfered in the American elections in 2016 to create chaos and problems here in the United States. So the Russian leader is clearly not going to help the U.S.-China relationship, and he's going to do everything possible to increase the frictions between us. I think that's one of the reasons, frankly, the United States and China need to work together and find a way through these problems, because I think the Russians are bent on a revision of the international world order. I don't believe China is. I believe China has benefited very greatly from the current international global order, and I think one of the things that the United States and China can agree on that perhaps the Russians do not agree on is that the international world order that has been established since World War II is to all of our benefit.
Professor Huang Jing, there is a popular assumption that the actual boss in the White House of Mr. Pompeo is John Bolton, who is called super hawkish. Now, what do you think of the inflammatory remarks by Secretary Pompeo at a major conference to talk about the future of the Arctic, which faces the global warming and melting of a kind of a prospective waterway. And this Secretary of State did a lot to put aside the role of China, which has invested billions of dollars in laying groundwork for free navigation in the Arctic region.
I think that I do not believe Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo are actually very even close. And but they're right. Both of them belong to the right wing, and too much right wing, and so-called newcomers. And for Pompeo's remarks on China on the environmental issue, I think is not appropriate. Of course, you can say United States and China has some differences, even fundamental differences. But on some issues, we call the common goods or public goods like environment, like Arctic issues and so on and so forth. I think there is enough room, ample room for China and United States to work together for the entire human being. That's exactly where the largest two powers need to cooperate instead of competing, especially in a way like Pompeo, made. I think that's not appropriate. For State Secretary to say something like that, I do not that really reflect America's fundamental interests.
Ms. Skinner also revealed that the State Department is composing something like a letter X, which appeared to be a reference to George Kenner's X article that laid out an argument for containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War to draw an iron curtain between the Soviet Union and the United States in the wake of the Second World War.
No, Dr. Skinner is no canon at all. Of course, letter X describes the Soviet Union, at that time former Soviet Union, is on the way for communism, which is totally unacceptable for freedom and liberty, because that's a two countries, representing two totally different ideologies. And the history has proven that the Russian or Soviet Union's way is the wrong way, no matter from economically or from political terms. So that letter X does have some historical merits in a way that it highlights the danger of communist expansion at that time. But now for Dr. Skinner to define the U.S. China competition because China is a non-Caucasian civilization, I think this is, like I just said, it's intellectually stupid and politically self-destructive and strategically disastrous for the United States. I do not believe United States should even should even think of this way. That's why I think, I don't think she's a mainstream. I agree with Professor Weber that she needs to resign. She has to be sacked, because if United States of America following her direction in policy making, then I think it will do irreparable damage to American interests. Because what she said and what she's thinking, and of course Steve Bannon is also that kind of people, is really anti-Americanism.
Let me go back to Pavel. Pavel, against the triumphant military parade that was taking place in the Red Square of Moscow, latest outcome of a poll showed that Joseph Stalin has been portrayed positively by some of those who polled in Russia. Now, in the understatement that draws a parallel comparison, probably in the upcoming letter X, the Chinese communism is unfortunately compared to Stalinism, and Gulag is something that we immediately think of. Now, this has drawn a lot of hot controversies for the media. Now, what happens in China is completely new reality, according to the Chinese observation. So what do you think of this kind of McCarthyist hysteria that constantly reminds us of the so-called yellow scare, yellow scare, if not red scare, that characterized the Cold War?
Yeah, that's present, and of course there's a lot of oversimplification, maybe deliberate oversimplification. Stalinism, yes, it's neither Russia nor though Stalin seems to be popular, because there's a lot of films and other things about the victory in the Second World War and the role of Stalin, and he's been promoted, and he became more popular than he was 10 years or 15 years ago. But today's Russia is not a Stalinist state. I mean, you can say a lot of things, but it's totally non-Stalinist. And today's China is absolutely non-Stalinist, and it's very, very different than China was in the 60s and 70s, absolutely. So there is differences, but there's also a lot of common ground. China and the United States are the biggest two trading partners in the world. They cannot just simply break off relations. It's not like during the Cold War, when trade between the communist bloc and the West was negligible, and that means they were looking at each other through the scopes of their rifles, but not trading, and trade could be kind of neglected. And now with America and China, that's impossible to do. They'll have to find a quid pro quo. No matter what ideologists in the State Department say.
Professor Wilder, it seems that there is a consensus across the aisle between Republicans and Democrats in the D.C. in their crusade against China. However, they haven't reached quite an agreement about how to deal with this rising power and the global implications that come along. What do you think of the nature of the latest standoff between these two biggest economies? How do you characterize, the geopolitical rivalry, quote-unquote, between these two countries, if we cannot draw easily a parallel comparison between China and the United States with the former Soviet Union as part of the broader context?
Well, first of all, the vast majority of Americans, and all the polling shows this, do see this as an economic competition, not a Cold War-style military competition. Most Americans do not feel a threat from China. They do not feel an existential threat, as they did with the Soviet Union when we used to have nuclear drills in our classrooms where people would prepare for a nuclear war. Americans do not think that way about China. That is not the view. I think actually the consensus that is beginning to build in Washington comes around a term called smart competition with China. And smart competition with China is an economic competition. It's a competition for influence in the world. It's a geostrategic competition, but on very different terms from those during the Cold War. And what Americans are looking at now, I think thinking Americans, are that there are two aspects to this. There is the domestic aspect, where we need to get our domestic economic house in order, rebuild our infrastructure, get ahead of the game in terms of 5G and even 6G technologies, artificial intelligence, these kinds of things. That it's a little bit like the space race, that maybe China has given us a wake-up call in this country, that we need to get our house in order, we need to set some goals here. And at the same time, internationally, we need to compete with China on the international table in terms of infrastructure spending. Americans are now thinking again about perhaps we should put more money into helping third world countries, developing countries, in the way that the BRI. So I think in some ways China has done an American favor by becoming a competitor, by becoming a rising power. We've had to look at ourselves and figure out what we're doing wrong and corrections. So I think the place that American policy is settling into is something called smart competition with China.
Professor Huang, don't you think the external pressure that President Trump and his team are building on China in what is called the business competition actually is doing China a favor, partly because the Chinese government would have to give a second thought as to how to reform the SOE and how to look at the relationship, a healthy one, between the government and the market?
It's quite ironic by revealing that, just like Professor Wilder said, China's rise has woke up the United States, realized that the United States has put its house in order. But same thing can be said to China, because in the past few years, China has become a little bit assertive internationally, and that assertiveness is based on the kind of confidence and pride over China's fast rise. But still, this kind of fast development also revealed a lot of problems, internal problems in China. China needs to restructure its economy to, like I said, the supply side reform, to deepen the reform, and also a lot of social political issues has to be addressed, not just by policy-wise, but institutional-wise. Having said that, I can quote Mr. Wider, but from other direction, that is, the Donald Trump's tough policy towards China also forced China to work harder and also to continue the kind of reform that can enable China sustain the fast development in the future. So in that way, I always argue that the competition between the United States and China looks like a competition, but actually it's a match between the two powers to see who put his house in order first.
Professor Huang, under the Trump administration, officials from Vice President Mike Pence to FBI Director Christopher Wray have called on a tougher approach to China. How effective is it at securing the U.S. leadership position, and how is that going to influence the future of the bilateral relationship, the most consequential one in the 21st century?
Yeah, I can understand why the people like Pence or Pompeo and Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, are in a kind of really almost desperate way in that way. But you do not maintain your leadership by destroying the international order, which United States took a major part to establish. You do not maintain international order by having people like Dr. Skinner serve in a major office. You do not maintain your leadership by destroy the multilateral international order by say, look, United States, American first, by taking this kind of very, I think, counterproductive unilateralism. That is not the way to maintain America's leadership in the world at all.
Let me go back to Pavel very quickly before we conclude this interesting discussion about Madam Skinner's recent remarks in the State Department. Russia has been accused of meddling with the U.S. elections of 2.5 years. But don't you think it is the United States that is arousing kind of a hate campaign to introduce the element of China 1 year ahead of the elections? Do you think this is part of the American domestic politics to single out China in what is called a scapegoating campaign?
Yes, it has been. The Republicans are using that. There was some recent remarks a day ago by Vice President Biden, who is apparently the front runner for the Democrats, who kind of said that the Chinese threat has been blown out of proportion. And he has been attacked by pro-Republican media. So yes, China most likely will be part of the campaign, but hopefully the new administration and even the present one will find ways of quid pro quo, because both countries cannot really afford a full trade war, not talking about a real Cold War. They should find a way together, and I believe they will eventually.
Thank you so much. In fact, Nancy Pelosi, spokesperson of the House, says she thanks President Trump for goading up to the campaign of impeachment, pending investigations on many other fronts against President Trump domestically, for example, revelations of his tax evasion, quote-unquote. Thank you very much, Professor Huang Jing, Mr. Pavel Falkenhorst, and Professor Dennis Wilder for joining our discussion about the U.S.-China relationship. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.